A mother checked the security cameras in her home and was left frozen upon discovering what her husband had been telling their 10-year-old daughter at night. Andrea woke up that morning with a strange feeling in her chest. The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee that she herself had prepared, and the sunlight filtered softly through the white linen curtains. At first glance, the house seemed serene. The gentle murmur of the morning radio, the soft shuffle of slippers across the floor, and the usual exchange of greetings formed an apparently ordinary family scene. However, a subtle tension floated in the air, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but obvious to those who lived within those walls. Andrea moved about carefully, trying to maintain that appearance of calm she had worked so hard to rebuild. Things between her and George had only just improved on the surface since that incident that had overshadowed their marriage some time ago, but a trace of resentment lingered between them. George, who was 38 years old, usually woke up before Andrea and Lily to check his work emails. His job as a consultant at a logistics company demanded early morning attention, and he often took international video calls before sunrise. Still, when Andrea went into the kitchen, he was there, flipping through the newspaper with a slight frown. He didn't greet her warmly, just gave a brief nod when she wished him good morning. It was a small gesture, lacking the warmth that once characterized their relationship. Andrea wasn't surprised. Deep down, she had grown accustomed to this courteous coldness. Lily, their 10-year-old daughter, came downstairs slowly, dragging her feet a bit. She had a messy ponytail and dark circles that contrasted with her young cheeks. Andrea noticed that Lily had slept poorly, but attributed it to nerves about the new school year that had just begun. For the past couple of weeks, the girl had seemed more restless than usual. She had nightmares, woke up in the middle of the night, and appeared worn out in the mornings. Andrea had tried talking with her, but Lily just shrugged, saying they were nothing but bad dreams or normal childhood fears. In the dining room, all three sat down to have breakfast. The clinking of the cutlery against the plates became an oppressive backdrop as they hardly spoke. Not wanting to bother anyone, Andrea asked her daughter about her first week of classes. Lily answered in monosyllables and avoided eye contact. George, perhaps to dodge any friction, focused on his cup of coffee, absorbed in thoughts he kept to himself. Andrea felt the urge to break the ice, but held back. Part of her knew that, no matter how much she tried to keep the conversation going, the atmosphere wouldn't improve as long as that old wound remained open. It had been almost 2 years since Andrea's infidelity nearly destroyed their marriage. She had never felt more remorse than in the weeks and months following that mistake. Over a tense and painful period, they had tried to repair the relationship, attending couples therapy and promising to be completely honest with each other. George said he forgave her, but time proved that fractured trust was not so easily restored. Although everyday life went on, work, Lily's school, and daily routines, the emotional rift between Andrea and George remained, an invisible barrier neither wanted to name. In that context, Lily's sleep issues initially went unnoticed, or were at least minimized. Andrea attributed her daughter's nighttime anxiety to starting a new grade, with different teachers and more responsibilities. Besides, Lily was growing, and Andrea clearly remembered that at 10, it was common to have vague fears or insecurities with no apparent cause. Nevertheless, every day Lily seemed more distracted and withdrawn, as if a constant worry kept her from relaxing. At night, Andrea heard faint noises in her daughter's room, footsteps or whispers she couldn't decipher. In the morning, Lily insisted it was just a bad dream. One night, Andrea got up for a glass of water and found the hallway light on. She walked toward Lily's room, where she saw the girl curled up under the covers, eyes wide open in the dark. When Andrea asked why she wasn't sleeping, Lily took a moment to answer, as if she had a secret she couldn't reveal. Finally, she said she'd heard noises at the window, maybe a branch tapping against the glass. Andrea calmed her with a kiss on the forehead, reassuring her there was nothing to fear, and went back to bed uneasy, thinking she needed to be more alert to these signs. Things with George were also growing stranger. On a couple of occasions, Andrea noticed that he offered to tuck Lily in, which had once been a sweet routine. However, afterward the house went utterly quiet, and Andrea wasn't sure how long George stayed in the girls' room or what they talked about before she finally fell asleep. She would hear faint murmuring, and after a few minutes, George would come out with a serious expression, saying nothing about Lily's supposed insomnia. That nighttime routine became a pattern Andrea assumed stemmed from her husband's good intentions, though something within her stirred with a faint suspicion. The next morning, Andrea noticed with concern that Lily once again looked exhausted. When she asked if the girl had slept at all, Lily only replied shyly that she felt tired. When George walked into the kitchen, Andrea tried bringing up their daughter's troubles, but his icy stare stopped her short. She felt guilty again, as though she had no right to voice her concerns. She chose to remain silent, figuring maybe she was overreacting, and that this was merely a normal adjustment period for her child. Thus, the first few days of their family routine went by, dominated by silence. Andrea perceived a growing tension, yet found no effective way to address it. Lily kept waking up in the middle of the night, staring blankly at dawn, trying to hide an unease that Andrea still couldn't fully grasp. Meanwhile, George remained formal and aloof, treating her with an almost professional politeness, as if their marriage were a contractual arrangement that allowed no room for warmth or trust. In that atmosphere of apparent normalcy and subtle fractures, the family continued its daily obligations as if nothing out of the ordinary were happening. No one yet suspected the importance those nights guarded by George would hold for the future. Day by day, although forced smiles and polite gestures covered their wounds, those fractures only deepened. Andrea sensed something she could not quite comprehend, a presence in Lily's insomnia and in her husband's increasingly heavy silences. Still, she did not dare look beyond the assumptions she found comfortable. She believed her daughter's anxiety stemmed from school, and that her own guilt from the infidelity made her see dangers where there were none. Unbeknownst to her, she was about to discover a reality far more disturbing than any unfounded fear. The neighborhood alarm went off one Tuesday morning, stirring up worry among the residents of the quiet street where Andrea and George lived. As Andrea stepped onto the porch to retrieve the newspaper, she saw her neighbor across the street, Mrs. Beltran, speaking with a couple of police officers in her front yard. The officers were taking notes and closely examining the fence. Andrea noticed Mrs. Beltran's troubled expression. She repeatedly ran her hand through her hair, visibly uneasy. As she approached, Andrea learned that the night before, someone had forced open the rear window of Mrs. Beltran's house and stolen several belongings, including a small safe containing family jewelry. In a trembling voice, Mrs. Beltran recounted the experience, saying she would never have imagined such a crime could happen in a neighborhood that had always been peaceful. Andrea offered her support and said goodbye to the police officers, worried about the situation and already thinking about her own family's safety. That evening, after dinner, Andrea decided to talk to George about it. They were both in the living room, each occupied with their own tasks. George was reading work reports on his tablet, while Andrea, on the couch, scrolled through her emails on her phone. Breaking the silence, she commented that it was time to take their security measures more seriously. She shared the details of the theft Mrs. Beltran had described, adding that many neighbors were planning to reinforce their locks or install alarm systems and security cameras. George, without looking away from his screen, mumbled some agreement. Yet when Andrea suggested installing cameras at home, she noticed him suddenly tense up. "Security cameras?" George repeated, frowning. "Don't you think that's a bit much? We've never had anything like that happen here, except for the neighbor's incident." Andrea insisted calmly, reminding him that you never knew when something similar could happen again. Besides, she pointed out that with Lily still being a child, she would rather take precautions. George merely gave a skeptical half-smile, and though he remained quiet, his demeanor revealed a strange discomfort about being recorded in his own house. "I'll think about it," he finally said, not sounding enthusiastic. But I'm warning you now. I don't like the idea of us being watched 24 hours a day. We're already under plenty of scrutiny with our phones." Andrea recognized a roadblock in that moment. George rarely shot down her ideas directly, but when something bothered him, he responded evasively. She took mental note of his resistance, but chose not to push. She decided to let time and the neighborhood's collective concern take their course. The next day, a phone call brightened Andrea's afternoon. Her sister Mary, who lived in another city, phoned to say she would be in town for a couple of days on business and wanted to visit. Andrea was excited at the thought of having her sister there. Mary was 4 years older, outgoing and kind, and she offered invaluable emotional support. Andrea invited her to stay at their place, and Mary agreed without hesitation, eager to see her niece Lily and catch up on family matters. When Mary arrived, Andrea greeted her with a big hug. They hadn't seen each other in months, and the happiness of the reunion contrasted with the tension in the house. Lily came out to say hello, shyly at first, but soon managing a small smile. George was polite and well-mannered, though slightly distant. That afternoon, Andrea took Mary to the kitchen to prepare her some tea and talk privately. Amid the aroma of chamomile, Mary asked how things were going in the marriage. Not wanting to lie, Andrea let out a long sigh before answering. "Things are still strange," she admitted. "Sometimes George is kind and attentive, but most of the time he's distant. I don't know if it's his job, if it's me, or the guilt I still carry for what I did." Mary looked at her sadly, then patted her hand. "Andrea, you know I've always supported you," she said gently. "But I've also noticed that he never got over the infidelity. I still see resentment in him. He may deny it, but the way he looks at you says it all." Andrea nodded in silence. She knew her sister wasn't trying to judge her, but rather to warn her about something obvious. George's wound had not healed. Not even couples therapy or Andrea's countless efforts to regain his trust had managed to erase that mark, which changed every glance, every conversation. Later, while Lily was doing her homework in her room, Andrea told Mary about what had happened to Mrs. Beltran and how she wanted to install security cameras to protect the house. Mary immediately agreed. Then Andrea mentioned George's reluctance. "Did he tell you why he doesn't like the idea?" Mary asked curiously. "He says it's over the top, that he doesn't want to feel watched. But I think there's something else. I don't know, for a while now he seemed different at night." Although she didn't want to alarm her sister, Andrea confessed that Lily had been dealing with insomnia for several weeks and that, in the early hours of the morning, she would hear George in the girl's room, speaking in a hushed tone. Mary reacted with a flicker of surprise, but held back from any sharp comments so as not to worry Andrea. The following day, George arrived home from work earlier than usual. He found the sisters in the dining room, looking over brochures from different security companies that Andrea had gathered. Catching Andrea's expectant look, George sighed, closed his eyes for a second, and then said, "Fine, let's install the cameras. If that makes you feel safer, go ahead." He didn't sound convinced, but Andrea, somewhat relieved, viewed his change of heart as a small victory. Perhaps Mary's arrival and her presence had swayed him. Sometimes, when others were around, George tried to be less obstinate, hoping to avoid unnecessary arguments. Still, as he looked over one of the brochures, Andrea once again sensed that shadow in his expression, something beyond mere opposition to a security camera. With the installation of the cameras now imminent, the household took on a new kind of tension. Andrea promised herself that once they were set up, she would occasionally check the recordings, not just to keep an eye out for intruders, but also to understand what was troubling Lily at night. Part of her felt uneasy about invading her own family's privacy, but she sensed something unusual was happening. She had no idea that this decision would soon open the door to truths she had never imagined discovering. That day ended with Mary and Andrea speaking quietly in the living room, while George went to bed earlier than normal. Lily had fallen asleep after dinner, worn out from the school day, and perhaps by the nighttime fears haunting her. Before saying goodnight, Mary looked at her sister and gently reminded her not to bear the entire weight of her guilt alone, since George was also displaying harmful behavior. Andrea listened in silence, her heart heavy, unsure whether a conflict was looming that would reopen old wounds or, on the contrary, usher in a new beginning. For now, installing the cameras was her only certainty. Without realizing it, that simple security measure would mark a before and after in their home. Clara Ramirez, Lily's music teacher, had always been attentive to her students. She had taught at the local primary school for several years and had a particular gift for sensing when a child was going through emotional struggles. She was especially fond of Lily because of her sweetness and her innate gift for rhythm and melody. However, in the past 2 weeks, Clara had noticed worrisome changes in the girl's behavior. She lost focus in class, stayed withdrawn at her desk, and avoided interacting with her classmates. During choir rehearsals, she barely joined in, and when she did, her voice sounded weak, almost unwilling. One afternoon after class, Clara approached Lily as she was gathering sheet music in the music room. The girl sat in the last row, her gaze distant. Clara gently asked if everything was going well at home. Lily looked at her briefly, as though wanting to reply, but in the end just shrugged and shook her head. Perceiving her students' discomfort, the teacher decided not to pressure her and instead reached out to the parents to share her concerns. The next day, Clara contacted Andrea and George to request a meeting. Andrea, visibly worried, agreed to come as soon as possible. George, on the other hand, seemed somewhat surprised. He hadn't received any formal complaints, but he agreed with apparent willingness. They planned to meet that same week in the school's conference room before Lily was dismissed from class. The afternoon of the meeting arrived. The sun was already low in the sky when Andrea and George stepped into the classroom Clara used as an office. The teacher welcomed them with a polite smile, although her expression revealed the gravity of what she wanted to discuss. After a few formalities, Clara calmly explained that she had noticed Lily seemed different, distracted, resistant to participate, and at times bearing an expression of subdued sadness. Andrea frowned. She knew Lily hadn't been sleeping well lately and that her dark circles were more pronounced, but she had no idea that her child's nighttime restlessness was affecting her school performance so drastically. She felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she and George were somehow transmitting their own tensions to their daughter. Meanwhile, George adopted a relaxed demeanor and gave the teacher a friendly smile. "Yes, Lily's been a bit nervous about the new school year," he acknowledged, fixing his gaze on Clara. "But I don't think it's anything serious. She's always been a bit sensitive." Andrea nodded, though less confidently. She felt that her husband was minimizing the issue. She added, "Teacher, we've noticed her looking tired and pensive at home too. We thought maybe it was the homework load or just the changes that come with her age. We're worried she might be too anxious." "Anxiety can have many triggers," Clara responded empathetically. "While it's true that some children get nervous when starting a new school year, Lily shows signs of isolating herself that go beyond simple shyness. I felt it was crucial to speak with you both to find the best way to help her." George then took on a protective air. He explained that Lily was his top priority and that, as her father, he intended to watch her closely. He mentioned enrolling her in extracurricular activities to boost her confidence and expressed his admiration for Clara's work, thanking her for her dedication. In that moment, Andrea perceived a duality in George. In front of the teacher, he seemed caring, responsible, even charming, completely unlike the distant indifference he often showed at home. Moved by the apparent concern of both parents, Clara wrapped up the conversation by suggesting that Lily might benefit from seeing the school counselor, someone who could encourage her to open up about her fears. Andrea took mental note of this, not wanting to rule out any potential help for her daughter. As they left, Andrea expressed her gratitude to Clara, who walked her to the door and whispered, "I'm glad to see George so involved. You'd be surprised how often parents become defensive whenever I bring up a concern. It's nice to see the opposite here. I hope you can both support Lily through all this. Andrea mustered a slight smile, but deep down, something didn't sit right. She sensed a forced quality in George, as if he were merely playing the role of the perfect father without truly feeling it. She chose not to share this perception with Clara and said goodbye. That night at home, Andrea sought out Lily to talk. She found her daughter sitting at her desk, working on a school project she had due soon. The girl's face showed how tired she was. Speaking gently, Andrea asked how she felt and if there was anything upsetting her. At first, Lily shook her head. She stayed silent, fiddling with a small piece of cardboard. Then, suddenly, she spoke in a halting voice. "Dad says not to trust certain people." Andrea looked at her, surprised. A chill ran down her spine. "Which people, Lily?" The girl blinked, as if frightened she had said too much. She pressed her lips together and merely shrugged, offering no further explanation. Andrea pressed a bit, but Lily wouldn't say another word. The mother sensed she might have pushed too hard. It might be better to approach the subject calmly another time, without pressuring her daughter. Before leaving, she stroked Lily's hair and wished her good night. In the early hours of the next morning, Andrea woke with a start upon hearing a faint murmur in the hallway. She left her room in time to see George coming out of Lily's room, gently shutting the door. He met Andrea's eyes with a surprised look, as if he hadn't expected to be caught. "She had a nightmare," he explained calmly. "I was just comforting her." Then he headed off to the master bedroom, leaving no room for further questions. Andrea could feel her heart pounding. That sight, combined with Lily's warning about not trusting certain people and the girl's growing exhaustion, unleashed a whirlwind of doubts in her mind. She tried convincing herself that George was simply acting like any father would, soothing his daughter through a bad dream. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being concealed in that nightly routine. The next morning went by under a silent strain. Lily left for school with slumped shoulders. Andrea went to work preoccupied with her conversation with Clara, the meeting, and her daughter's troubling words. Meanwhile, George came across as attentive while making coffee, casually discussing the weather and the day's schedule, as though nothing at all were amiss. Andrea recognized that duplicity. To the outside world, her husband looked like the ideal father, but it was becoming increasingly clear that behind that facade lay a resentment that might not be directed solely at her. It could also involve Lily in ways Andrea didn't yet understand. That same afternoon, her mind spinning with doubts, Andrea decided she could no longer stand by. She had to uncover the source of her daughter's fears, and most importantly, the reason George seemed so determined to control what Lily knew. Though she still had no hard evidence of anything, she could sense that something sinister was brewing in her daughter's room during those silent hours. Little did she know that she was on the brink of discovering the truth, one that would trigger the worst crisis her family had ever faced. Andrea had spent the entire week feeling uneasy, as if an invisible hand were pressing down on her chest every time night fell. Insomnia had become her constant companion. She often heard footsteps or whispers coming from the hallway and awoke with the sudden certainty that something was happening in Lily's room. Yet whenever she got up and opened the door, she found only silence and darkness. Lily slept, or pretended to, curled up on her bed with messy curls and a serene face, while George showed no sign of having left his own bed. Even so, Andrea couldn't shake off the sense of dread that followed her each night. Ever since she installed the security cameras because of the neighborhood burglary, she had taken to reviewing them out of caution, though she never really expected to find anything unusual. One day, after dropping Lily off at school, she poured herself a cup of coffee and decided to sit at the computer to check the previous night's footage. She had woken several times and believed she had heard a strange noise, perhaps something hitting the back door or a window creaking. Unable to rest until she ruled out any break-in, she started playing the recordings in chronological order. Most of the early morning clips showed nothing of importance, just dimly lit hallways or the exterior yard, all still. However, when she got to the camera covering the bedroom hallway, she noticed a slight change in lighting around 2 in the morning. She turned up the volume and watched closely. There was George, leaving the master bedroom and walking toward Lily's room. He paused for a few seconds outside the door, as if listening to make sure no one else was awake, then slipped inside quietly. A chill ran through Andrea as she watched her husband move that way, soundless, as though he had a hidden purpose. She pressed her lips together and kept watching. George stayed in Lily's room for almost 15 minutes. There was no crying or calling out from the girl, which struck Andrea as odd. Usually, if Lily had nightmares, she would call out or cry for her mother. Why then was George going in when there seemed to be no sign of distress? After that time had passed, Andrea saw George emerge and carefully close the door. Barely a minute later, the camera showed Andrea herself stepping into the hallway, peering around. This matched the exact moment she had awakened due to the supposed noise. But the surprise didn't end there. When she moved the cursor back to replay and listen more closely, she discovered a faint murmuring in certain parts of the recording. It was hard to make out exact words, but one phrase stood out clearly. "Don't trust your mother." Andrea felt her breath catch. She paused the footage and rewound it multiple times, trying to isolate the moment. Each time she replayed that segment, she felt a knot tighten in her throat. George's tone was low, almost a whisper, but the words were unmistakable. "Don't trust your mother." Why would he say that to Lily? She tried to pick up other stray words. "She doesn't," and "she lies to you." Everything was jumbled, a patchwork of disjointed statements. Yet it was impossible not to conclude that George was trying to plant distrust in the girl, turning her against her own mother. Her mind raced with chaotic thoughts. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time, or had it been happening for weeks or even months? Her head buzzed with questions and fears. She remembered those moments when Lily seemed on the verge of confessing something, those half-finished sentences about "Dad says" and the constant nightmares. A shiver went through her at the thought that her husband might be manipulating the child, harming her psychologically, all because of a resentment Andrea had believed was at least partly behind them. For several minutes, she stayed at the desk, unsure what to do next. Should she call George and confront him on the spot? Demand an explanation immediately? A rush of anger and pain flooded her. She wanted to burst into his office right then and there and shout at him that he had no right to poison their daughter's mind with lies. But something held her back. Fear. She knew George's temperament. She had experienced firsthand the rigidity of his wounded pride and the bitterness he still harbored since the infidelity. She also remembered talking with Mary about how deep that bitterness ran, how George would accuse her of lacking moral standing to question him. Now she understood that if she acted rashly and George denied the evidence or destroyed the recordings, she might lose her chance to protect Lily completely. Hands trembling, she picked up the phone and called her sister. Mary answered right away, alarmed by Andrea's agitated tone. "Mary, it's about George. I need to tell you something. Please, come as soon as you can." In less than half an hour, Mary arrived at the house. She found Andrea with red eyes and a drawn expression. Without any preamble, Andrea led her to the computer and showed her the video. Mary covered her mouth with her hand when she heard the phrase, "Don't trust your mother." "Oh my God, Andrea," she exclaimed when the clip ended. "What on earth is George doing? This is really serious." Andrea couldn't answer, overwhelmed by sadness and anger. She pressed her hands to her face, thinking about Lily, how fragile she had seemed lately. How many nights had she endured those words? How must it feel for a 10-year-old when the person she trusts most fills her head with ideas that erode her bond with her mother? "I don't know what to do," Andrea admitted, her voice shaking. "I want to confront him, but I'm terrified he'll react violently, or destroy the evidence, or twist things around in his favor. I can't stand the thought of him continuing to say these things to Lily. It's already affecting her." Mary placed an arm around her shoulders and guided her back into the chair. Listen, the most important thing is protecting Lily. But to do that, you need solid proof. Unfortunately, he could deny everything and claim the videos are doctored. You have to keep a cool head. If you confront George without a plan, he could flip the story and make you out to be paranoid. Andrea nodded slowly. It pained her to admit it, but her sister was right. George had already shown he could play the victim and model father in public. He also knew Andrea's vulnerabilities all too well, especially the guilt she still carried from her affair. He could manipulate those feelings to discredit her. "So, what do you suggest?" Andrea asked, unable to hold back the tears clouding her eyes. "Am I supposed to just sit back while he keeps poisoning my daughter?" "Of course not," Mary replied firmly. "But before you act, gather more evidence. The cameras record audio, even if it's faint. Make sure to store backup copies in the cloud or on external drives. If you can, start manual recordings for clearer audio. Don't let him realize you already know the truth. We have to be smarter than he is." Andrea took a deep breath, clenching her fists. She had never felt such an intense mix of fury and despair. But she knew she had to follow Mary's advice. That footage was only the tip of the iceberg. She was convinced that if she looked through more nights, she would find other similar incidents, possibly with even more damaging remarks. "I'll do it," she said, trying to wipe away her tears. "I won't let him beat me. Lily is what matters most. I'm not going to let him manipulate her any longer." Before leaving, Mary hugged Andrea tightly and promised to stand by her throughout the process. Part of Andrea was terrified about the battle she was about to wage in her own home, but another part, the maternal side, was already steeled with resolve. She would protect her daughter above all else, even if that meant confronting George's anger and reopening wounds she had thought were closed. Heart pounding and her mind full of plans, Andrea remained alone in the house, knowing that the images she had just discovered would forever change her family's dynamic. She finally had the first tangible proof that George was far from the perfect father he pretended to be. And although the road to proving it would be long and complicated, she could no longer afford to turn a blind eye. Lily deserved the truth. In the days that followed, Andrea lived in a constant state of tension, trying to follow Mary's advice to gather more evidence and carefully assess the situation before making any decisive move. She reviewed more footage from the cameras, though each time she saw George enter Lily's room in the middle of the night, a fresh wave of anger washed over her. She picked up additional snippets of whispers, but the audio was so low that she could only make out a few scattered words. "Your mother," and "don't say anything." Those phrases ate away at her, imagining the effect they must be having on her daughter's mind. Andrea arrived home in a hurry one afternoon, deeply shaken by something Lily had told her. Almost in a whisper, the girl had confessed that she no longer wanted to sleep alone because Daddy says scary things. In that moment, all the restraint Andrea had tried so hard to maintain completely fell apart. Seeing Lily so nervous and unable to eat had become unbearable. Her heart ablaze with indignation and concern, she decided she could no longer postpone a confrontation. She locked herself in her room and selected a clear segment of the recording where George could be heard saying, "Don't trust your mother." She turned the volume up to the maximum and saved it in a separate file. That same night, when George got home from work, she was waiting for him in the living room with the TV on, ready to show him the evidence. "I need to talk to you," she announced bluntly. George set his briefcase aside, instantly noting Andrea's stern expression. Before he could respond, she picked up the remote and played the excerpt she had taken from the security footage. On the screen, he appeared entering Lily's room at 2 in the morning. The audio, though faint, was enough to make out the phrase Andrea had isolated. George stood rooted to the spot, staring at the screen. Then he frowned and shook his head. "This doesn't mean anything," he muttered tensely. "You know how distorted the camera audio can get with any kind of noise. Lily was having nightmares. I was just comforting her." Andrea straightened up, feeling her blood boil. She pointed at the TV, where the footage kept playing. "That's not comforting her. You're telling her not to trust me. Why would you do that?" she shouted, losing the composure she had tried so hard to maintain. For a moment, it looked like George might give a more detailed explanation. But when he saw the resolve in Andrea's eyes, his expression changed. Suddenly, he adopted a look of outrage and pointed sharply at the screen. "And how dare you accuse me of betraying someone's trust?" he snapped, his tone heavy with resentment. "Have you forgotten what you did 2 years ago? Forgotten how you deceived me, how you wrecked my life and our family?" Andrea felt her bravado slip away the instant he brought up her infidelity. It was as though each time she tried raising a serious issue, he slammed that incident down on the table, fully aware that her guilt still tore at her inside. Pressing a hand to her chest, she tried to keep herself in check. "I know," she said unsteadily. "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. But what you're doing has no justification. Lily's suffering. You're confusing her. Look at her these days. She barely sleeps or eats." Yet George stuck to his version. He insisted it was all a misunderstanding, that Andrea was taking things out of context because of her lingering guilt, and that he was only trying to help Lily through her nightmares. He even claimed the girl was afraid for other reasons, perhaps due to the neighborhood break-in or her new school responsibilities. "Stop looking for blame where there is none," he finished with a vaguely menacing tone. "And by the way, watch what you do with those recordings. You have no idea what kind of trouble we could get into if you go exposing our private lives." Andrea noticed how he stared at her with narrowed eyes, as though sizing up her reaction. She realized at that moment that George wouldn't budge in the slightest or offer any honest explanation. He had decided either to deny or choose whatever excuse served him best. Nor did he seem unsettled by being caught on camera. On the contrary, he was prepared to weaponize Andrea's guilt against her. She felt a hollowness in her chest, and despite her anger, found herself momentarily paralyzed. It was hard to believe that someone she had once loved so deeply could behave so manipulatively and cruelly. The argument lasted until Lily, alarmed by the shouting, appeared in the doorway with red, teary eyes. Upon seeing his daughter, George softened his expression and shifted to a kind, almost fatherly tone, like putting on a mask in an instant. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said, beckoning her closer. "Mom and I are just talking about something unimportant." Andrea wanted to protest, but bit her tongue when she saw Lily's confused face. The tension in the air was palpable. The girl stepped back, trembling, as though she wanted to flee from a scene she didn't understand, but found frightening nonetheless. Andrea sighed, holding back her anger in front of her daughter. It was clear that pushing the confrontation further right then would accomplish nothing good. After that heated night, Lily began to show more obvious signs of stress. She would wake up without an appetite and often couldn't even finish her breakfast. Andrea noticed her daughter avoiding being alone in her room, and once evening came, she always found excuses to stay out of bed. She complained of headaches or claimed she had homework left to do. When she finally fell asleep, she was tormented by relentless nightmares that made her scream in the middle of the night. Andrea would rush in only to find the girl sweaty and agitated, staring into space. It was getting harder to soothe her, and never once did Lily mention George in those night terrors, which Andrea found all the more alarming. Andrea also saw that her daughter was growing increasingly fearful of the dark. Lily insisted on keeping the hallway light or a bedside lamp on. Several times when Andrea checked on her in the small hours, she'd find her wide awake, hugging a teddy bear, unable to sleep. All of this only intensified Andrea's guilt. She felt both powerless and cornered. If she confronted George in front of Lily, the tension became overwhelming. But if she remained silent, she allowed him to continue manipulating the girl and fueling her fears. The week wore on under a heavy atmosphere at home. George acted as if the confrontation had never happened. At times, he feigned normalcy, focusing on his job and making trivial remarks about TV or dinner. At other times, he unleashed a biting sarcasm that cut Andrea to the quick. Whenever he alluded to her past infidelity, he looked at her with suppressed rage, as though that one mistake justified anything he might do from then on. Thus, Andrea found herself trapped in a wrenching dilemma. She knew she had to protect Lily, but the shadow of her own guilt sapped her strength. Each time she tried to challenge George again, he silenced her by dredging up the past, reminding her that she had no moral authority to accuse him. Furious and hurt, Andrea kept wondering whether her marital mistake had triggered the spiral of manipulation and resentment now afflicting her daughter. Deep down, she realized that simply confronting him wasn't enough. She would need support, a more substantial plan, and above all, the courage to admit that Lily's well-being was at risk. Not physically, but in the deepest psychological sense. Only then could she oppose George's denial and threats without crumbling beneath her own remorse. Andrea spent several days feeling trapped in a dead end. After confronting George, she realized that showing him the footage had only made him dig in more stubbornly. Worse yet, any mention of the infidelity paralyzed her on the spot. Whenever she tried to defend Lily from his manipulations, he would simply remind her of her past, invalidating her protests. The weight of that guilt, combined with her worry over her daughter's emotional decline, left her in a constant state of anxiety. Still, Andrea refused to give up. Following Mary's advice, she continued gathering more evidence, determined to improve the quality of the recordings. The hallway camera's audio was limited. Ambient noise and distance meant she could only pick up bits and pieces of conversation. So she decided to place an extra microphone in Lily's room, hiding it inside an everyday item to avoid suspicion. She consulted various online tutorials and ended up buying a small device that could link to her phone for continuous recording. Despite the unease of invading her own daughter's privacy, Andrea knew her first priority was discovering what really happened when George entered the room. If Lily couldn't bring herself to speak, the only way to find out was to covertly listen in on those conversations. One afternoon, while the girl was at school and George was still at work, she concealed the microphone inside a stuffed animal Lily barely used, placing it discreetly on a shelf near the bed. During the first 2 nights, she didn't catch anything different from what she already suspected. Muffled whispers and the gentle tone of George talking to Lily while she sobbed. But on the 3rd night, around 1 in the morning, Andrea recorded audio that turned her blood cold. George's voice could be heard clearly enough, telling Lily, "Your mother cheated on us, and now she plays the victim. She doesn't really care about you." There was a tense silence on the recording, followed by a trembling mumble from Lily, asking something inaudible. George responded, "Don't worry, I'm here for you. Just don't tell your mother anything. She's selfish. Do you understand?" Andrea froze at the bluntness of that direct manipulation. She felt nauseous, trembling from head to toe as she listened to the audio again and again, almost unable to believe what she was hearing. This went beyond all doubt. George was using his bitterness over the infidelity to poison Lily's mind against her. The next day, she called Mary and played her the file, covering her mouth to hold back her anger and tears. Mary listened quietly and, when the recording finished, burst out, "This is worse than I imagined. We can't just sit around and do nothing." It was Mary who suggested she contact Laura, a 40-year-old family lawyer she knew from a complicated custody case involving a friend. Andrea hesitated. Going to a lawyer meant admitting her marriage was broken, that the situation was severe enough to warrant legal help. But Mary's voice was firm. "If you won't do it for yourself, do it for Lily. George is harming her emotional well-being. This kind of manipulation can't be brushed off." Andrea agreed and called Laura to schedule an appointment. Within 2 days, she met the attorney at a modest but tidy office, its walls lined with diplomas and certificates in family mediation. Laura received her calmly, inviting her to sit down and share her story from the beginning. Andrea spoke through sighs and frequent pauses, trying not to break down every few seconds. "What you're describing," Laura said in a measured voice, "is psychological abuse and emotional manipulation of a minor. This is a very serious matter, You need to gather all possible evidence and store it somewhere safe. Under no circumstances, let your husband realize you have these recordings. If he erases or destroys them, you'll lose your main tool to protect your daughter." Andrea nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time. Laura laid out the steps: collect the recordings, gather any testimonies or proof that George, motivated by resentment, was pushing Lily toward rejecting her mother. Then they would consider a legal strategy that might include filing a complaint and seeking protective measures for Lily if the situation became untenable. "I'll do whatever it takes," Andrea murmured. "I can't stand seeing Lily wither away, day by day." Laura placed a hand on her shoulder and stressed the importance of discretion. A single wrong move could alert George and provoke him into legal or manipulative action. A few days later, when Andrea thought things couldn't get any more complicated, she received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Rick, a 45-year-old psychologist and a friend of George's. Andrea frowned, puzzled. He explained that he and George had been college friends, though their friendship had been on and off. Andrea only vaguely recalled him from a couple of past gatherings. "Sorry to call you directly," Rick said, "but I'm worried about George. Lately we've been talking, and he keeps bringing up your infidelity. Some of the things he says sound really strange. At times it's almost like he's obsessed. He's mentioned revenge fantasies that concern me. I just want to know if everything's okay at home." Andrea shuddered. She hadn't expected any form of support from someone close to George. Immediately, she wondered how much she could trust this man. What if Rick was feeding information back to George? Could it be a trap to find out if Andrea was storing recordings? She bit her lower lip, uncertain. "Things are delicate right now," she answered cautiously. "I'm not sure what George might have told you, but I'd rather be careful." Rick picked up on her wariness. "I understand. I'm not trying to cause you any discomfort, but from a psychologist's perspective, I think George needs help. I'm also worried about Lily. He told me the girl doesn't want to sleep alone and that you're the reason for it. Honestly, it doesn't add up. I wanted to talk to you before jumping to conclusions." Andrea stayed silent for a few moments, weighing the situation. She could cut off all communication with Rick, or she could see if he might be an unexpected ally who could confirm how unstable George was becoming. In the end, she took a deep breath and decided to share a bit of her perspective without mentioning her recordings. "What I'm about to tell you is serious. George isn't well. He's taking out his resentment on our daughter. I need your complete discretion, Rick, because this could get worse if he finds out we're talking." Rick promised confidentiality, adding that if Andrea ever needed it, he could provide a professional assessment of George's behavior. However, he clarified that he wouldn't participate in any lies or manipulation. He would only speak the truth if it became necessary. Andrea thanked him for the offer, but remained on guard. After hanging up, her mind was racing. On the one hand, having Laura's help and the possibility that Rick might back them up offered a hint of hope in the dark tunnel she found herself in. On the other hand, her distrust of George extended to his acquaintances too. Andrea couldn't be sure Rick was truly acting out of good intentions. For now, she could only move forward with caution, carefully preserving her recordings and following the lawyer's advice. George's manipulation had finally been exposed beyond all doubt. "Your mother cheated on us, and now she's acting like the victim. She doesn't really care about you." With those words, he revealed the depth of his resentment and how he was using it against Lily. Andrea, determined to protect her daughter, understood that her only option was to gather every piece of evidence and as much legal advice as possible, even if that meant revealing the most painful corners of her private life to outsiders. She realized there was no other way. Only by taking that path could she free Lily from the nightmare unfolding each night under their own roof. Clara realized something very serious was going on with Lily the afternoon the girl, in the middle of choir practice, burst into tears for no apparent reason. Under the astonished gaze of her classmates, Lily covered her face with both hands and ran to a corner of the classroom, sobbing almost desperately. Seeing such an intense reaction, Clara stopped the lesson and approached carefully, trying to calm her. Yet the child kept trembling and begged, between sobs, not to be forced to speak. Clara had to call the school nurse to check on Lily, so great was the commotion. Once the girl had calmed down somewhat, Clara accompanied her to the principal's office and called Andrea to come immediately. When Andrea arrived, she found her daughter's face swollen from so much crying. The school principal, who was aware of Lily's academic situation, suggested that the child rest at home for the remainder of the day. Worried and sincere, Clara offered to speak privately with Andrea after Lily was taken somewhere safe. Later, when Lily was in the school nurse's waiting area, Clara and Andrea went into an improvised office. There, the teacher closed the door to avoid interruptions. The light filtering in through the window highlighted the exhaustion in Andrea's expression, and Clara noticed at once that the mother was on the brink of her endurance. "Andrea, I've seen kids get nervous about tests or other problems, but with Lily, it goes further than that," Clara began softly, trying to convey empathy. "She's extremely anxious and withdrawn. Today she couldn't even handle the music she usually loves. She just fell apart for no obvious reason. I'm concerned something serious is happening at home." Andrea, fingers tightly entwined, didn't know how to respond. She recalled Laura's advice to be discreet, but she couldn't deny reality to Clara, who had already shown genuine concern for Lily's well-being. In a trembling voice, she admitted they were going through a profound family crisis and that George was behaving strangely toward their daughter. Without disclosing every detail, she did say her husband talked to Lily at night and manipulated her into mistrusting her mother. "I've tried to help her," Andrea murmured, holding back tears. "But it all gets more complicated every day. Lily is breaking down at the slightest trigger, and George denies everything or accuses me of exaggerating. I don't know how to protect her without causing an even bigger disaster." Clara rested a hand on Andrea's arm. Though she wasn't aware of the infidelity or George's bitterness, she grasped enough to sense the gravity of the situation. "You can count on me for whatever you need. I can write a report on Lily's emotional state if you need the school's support. Anything that might help prove she needs help." Andrea nodded gratefully. She felt immensely relieved to know she wasn't alone, that someone outside her immediate circle recognized the seriousness of the situation. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Rick had decided to speak with George after that strange phone call with Andrea. The psychologist went to his old friend's office, hoping to invite him for coffee and a calm conversation. George, upon seeing him, seemed surprised at first. However, when Rick mentioned his concerns about the obsession with the infidelity and the potential emotional harm to Lily, George reacted with anger. "What right do you have to poke around in my business?" George exploded, raising his voice enough to attract the attention of nearby employees. "I don't need your help or your advice. Besides, you have no idea what's happened in my marriage." Rick tried to stay composed, explaining that he only wanted to help, that he was worried about the girl and George's increasingly hostile behavior toward Andrea. But George, getting more agitated, refused to listen. He tossed his coffee cup into a trash can and abruptly ended the conversation. "Stay out of it, and don't come to me with that nonsense again." The contempt in his voice was enough for Rick to realize that his old friend had crossed a dangerous line. This was no ordinary grudge. It seemed more like a desire for vengeance, one that did not spare even his own daughter. Worried and disappointed, Rick left the office convinced that George was out of control. After some thought, he decided to call Andrea to offer his support. Although he would remain cautious, he was resolved to take her side if the situation demanded it. That night, George arrived home early, carrying an air of tense formality. Andrea, who was in the kitchen cooking dinner, watched him from the corner of her eye and noticed something different in his expression, as though he had just fought an internal battle. Yet he said nothing to her. He limited himself to trivial remarks and asked about Lily, who was resting in her room after the incident at school. Andrea answered in monosyllables, wary of provoking another argument. After dinner, George shut himself in the study, staying there until late into the night. Andrea assumed he was working on a project, but the next day, when she tried to check the camera footage as usual, she discovered that many recordings were corrupted or completely missing. Folders from recent days contained unusable files, impossible to open. A cold sweat ran down her back as she realized it couldn't just be a technical glitch. She raced to look at her backups, only to find they had been tampered with as well. Jumbled files or audio cut in such a way that it appeared Andrea was yelling or saying harsh things to Lily. It was a clumsy montage, but it could be enough to raise suspicion if George showed it to others. Her throat tightened at the realization that this was the counterattack she'd been dreading. "This can't be happening," she cried in despair, checking the folders over and over. It was clear that her caution alone wasn't enough. George had taken the initiative, showing he was aware of her surveillance and had no intention of standing by. Desperate, she phoned Mary and then Laura. The lawyer responded urgently. "Save anything that isn't altered in a place he can't access, preferably on an external hard drive and in encrypted cloud storage. And don't bring this up with George yet. You still had the audio backed up on your phone, right?" Andrea exhaled, recalling that yes, the audio recordings from the microphone in Lily's room were stored separately, with passwords George did not know. At least those were still safe, she thought with relief. Even so, the tampering with the videos made her position more vulnerable. If George used that doctored material to accuse her of mistreating Lily, the legal chaos could be devastating. Tension escalated quickly. That same night, George had the nerve to hint that certain videos showed Andrea applying psychological pressure on Lily. He spoke in a frigid tone, giving her a sidelong glance, as though he'd been silently enduring injustice for months. Andrea felt fear mingle with anger. She knew perfectly well that footage was manipulated. Meanwhile, Lily was sinking deeper into her anxiety. Sometimes she tried to approach her mother but pulled away, terrified of saying something that might spark another family explosion. Clara had warned Andrea that the girl was on the brink of a more severe nervous crisis, and Andrea could no longer deny the signs: lack of appetite, dark circles under her eyes, and that dull look of someone living in constant fear. Amid this turmoil, Rick contacted Andrea again, asking to meet. He carefully explained how George had rejected him aggressively, confirming his suspicions about George's obsession with the past. Andrea, though still wary, agreed to see him. Any extra support might prove vital. Meanwhile, Clara stayed informed, ready to provide professional testimony on Lily's abrupt change in behavior. Thus, all the subplot threads converged at one pressure point. Andrea had Clara's empathy, Laura's legal support, Rick's partial cooperation, and Mary's unwavering loyalty. But George had already launched his offensive by corrupting and falsifying the recordings, leaving Andrea cornered, unsure of her next move, and with her heart breaking each time she saw Lily sink further into anguish. A final showdown was coming, and no one could predict how devastating its consequences would be for a family that had once seemed so stable and happy. The days following Andrea's discovery of the doctored videos were pure torment. She could barely sleep, constantly picturing the footage she had seen before George altered the files. The cruelest part was realizing he intended to use them to prove she was abusive toward Lily. At first, she thought the montage was too outlandish to be taken seriously, easy to disprove. But as she reviewed the manipulated content, she saw that George had been meticulous. By using editing and repetition, he had woven a story where Andrea's voice appeared to hurl insults and excessive scolding at her daughter. One afternoon, while Mary was visiting, Andrea showed her a fragment she had managed to recover. The video started with Lily crying, sitting on her bed. In the background, Andrea's voice could be heard angrily saying, "I've told you 1,000 times, stop bothering me." Immediately afterward, there was a click, a jump in the image, and then the same phrase played again, only louder. It looked as if Andrea had shouted the same words twice in a row, without pause. Following another abrupt cut, the image showed Lily backing away with a terrified expression. The manipulation was obvious. The desynchronized image and sound, the loops, the abrupt edits. Still, for someone unaware of the real story, the result could appear convincing. "This is sick," Mary said, her voice charged with indignation. "It's obvious that George wants to destroy you legally, Andrea. He intends to use these videos as proof that you mistreat Lily." "But how could he go so far?" Andrea murmured, shocked by the cruelty of using their child in such a scheme. "And the worst part is, if someone in authority watches these clips without an expert analysis, they might really believe I'm being abusive." Mary reminded her that Laura, the attorney, had already warned about the risks of a legal offensive from George. With a lump in her throat, Andrea realized that it wasn't just Lily's peace of mind at stake. It was also Andrea's custody of her daughter. If George managed to present these alleged pieces of evidence first, Andrea's position would be seriously compromised. That very night, Laura called them to her office, a small space she used for handling delicate family cases. Seated around a table scattered with paperwork, they carefully reviewed each doctored video clip that Andrea had managed to salvage. Laura, looking both professional and concerned, explained the steps they needed to take. "We'll need a forensic specialist in audio and video to prove these recordings have been spliced, repeated, and digitally edited," she said, pointing at the laptop screen. "It's obvious to the naked eye, but in front of a judge, we need a technical analysis." Mary couldn't tear her eyes away from the fabricated evidence, her blood boiling at the thought that George planned to present it as truth. Andrea, meanwhile, tried to keep her composure. She clung to the hope that the original recordings, along with the audio files she had saved in the cloud, would be enough to counter any defamation attempts. Still, her greatest fear was the effect all this would have on Lily. Andrea's worst fears were coming true, slowly but surely. Day by day, she saw her daughter growing more distant and reluctant to talk to her. Lily responded coldly, rejected hugs, and sometimes even covered her ears if Andrea tried to explain something. Andrea realized that George's planted doubts were taking root in the girl's mind, the possibility that her mother really was the villain in the story. One afternoon, when Andrea tried to give Lily a kiss on the forehead, the girl pulled away abruptly. "Why are you always mad at me?" she burst out, her voice trembling. That question completely broke Andrea's heart. She looked at Lily with indescribable pain. "Sweetheart, I'm never mad at you," she answered, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Who's telling you otherwise? Is Dad saying that?" But Lily said nothing. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she couldn't bring herself to speak. After a moment, she pulled away from Andrea's hand and ran to lock herself in her room. That rejection pierced Andrea deeply. She had to lean against the wall to keep herself from collapsing. She felt she was gradually losing her daughter's trust, the same trust she had nurtured for 10 years with love and closeness. All she could do was rage inwardly at the knowledge that George was undoubtedly whispering more lies each night. Seeing Andrea so devastated, Mary offered to take Lily to her house for a few days, under the pretext that she needed some company for a work trip. However, when she casually proposed this plan, George immediately refused, claiming that Lily had to keep up with her school routine and that the family wasn't in the mood for experiments or trips. Andrea interpreted his refusal as further proof that her husband did not want to lose control over their daughter for even a moment. Meanwhile, Laura and Mary insisted that Andrea stay calm and continue gathering evidence of the manipulation Lily was experiencing. They advised her to keep a journal of every incident, every odd phrase or reaction from her daughter, and to talk with Clara so that the teacher, too, could testify about Lily's erratic behavior. Any information could later prove useful if they ended up in a custody battle or filed charges for psychological mistreatment. "Don't let your guard down," Laura stressed. "George is determined to accuse you of the worst, and if he sees you panicking, he may use it against you." Andrea understood the logic behind that advice, but each passing day intensified the unbearable tension. On one hand, she felt the urgent need to save Lily from the toxic atmosphere at home. On the other, she feared George would file a complaint first or destroy the remaining evidence, forcing her to proceed with extreme caution. This ambivalence gnawed at her, as did the overwhelming guilt she still carried over her infidelity. That past mistake pained her more than ever, for George kept wielding it like a weapon to humiliate her and justify his actions. Lily's turmoil was increasingly apparent. She seemed distracted, anxious, and was showing more and more rejection toward Andrea. From time to time, she would make remarks like, "Dad loves me more," or "You're always scolding me." Her drawings in school grew progressively darker, full of shadows. Clara, the music teacher, noted that even in class, Lily avoided eye contact and distanced herself from her classmates. Not even music, her once beloved passion, seemed able to console her. Each night, Andrea went to bed dreading that at any moment George might take his forged recordings to the authorities. She imagined the scenario of a social worker or a judge watching those so-called proofs that she was verbally abusing Lily, and her heart clenched at the thought that no one might believe her when she claimed they had been faked. As desperately as she wanted to reveal the truth, she knew that manipulated evidence could become a dangerously effective weapon in George's hands. The arguing in the household had become so relentless that Andrea could hardly tell day from night. Lily, more confused than ever, continued to spurn her mother, and the tension seeped into the walls of what had once been a safe home. Feeling stifled by George's accusations and her fear of losing custody, Andrea clung to one remaining hope, proving that her husband was manipulating their daughter with twisted, vengeful motives. Yet each time she checked her recordings, she discovered new files that had been corrupted or tampered with. One afternoon, while visiting Clara at school to discuss Lily's performance, Andrea confided her worries in hushed tones. She was afraid the walls themselves might have ears, but Clara urged her to continue. Having no one else to trust besides the woman so concerned about her daughter, Andrea revealed the details about the forged videos and the audio files that kept vanishing or getting distorted. Clara, thoughtful, offered a potential solution. She knew a former student, Matteo, who had become a forensic IT specialist. "He could check your cloud files and see if there are intact copies he can recover," Clara suggested. "He's really good at digital security. Maybe he can restore what George thought he erased." Andrea latched onto that idea like a drowning person to a lifeline. She immediately called Laura, the attorney, and shared Clara's proposal. Laura agreed it was an excellent opportunity, provided the expert was entirely trustworthy. A few days later, they all met at Laura's office to try to recover the original content incriminating George. Matteo, the young tech specialist, arrived with a backpack full of external hard drives, USB sticks, and specialized software tools. After logging into Andrea's cloud account, he delved into the intricate maze of files, backups, and metadata. The process was tense and grueling. For hours, Andrea, Mary, and Clara watched with bated breath as Laura and Matteo sifted through hundreds of folders. Finally, toward evening, the expert looked up with a smile. "Some of the files are severely damaged, but not all of them," he said with the calm tone of someone who knows he's brought good news. "I found automatic backups on another server George didn't get to. There are several videos here and, more importantly, audio files with dates and timestamps that show the sequence of events." Andrea's heart skipped a beat. Mary leaned in to look at the screen. There they were, records leaving no doubt about George's damaging words. From the infamous "don't trust your mother" to other disturbing phrases like "she only pretends she loves you." Patiently, Matteo sorted the material, saving it securely onto external drives. Laura encouraged them to listen to one of the clearer audio clips, and Andrea felt a cold chill as she recognized George's voice coolly repeating, "You belong to me. Your mother ran off with another man back then, and now she wants to act like she cares about this family." At that moment, Andrea broke down in tears, overwhelmed by rage, relief, and deep sadness all at once, hearing such blatant manipulation. Clara squeezed her hand, and Mary put an arm around her. Laura, looking serious, emphasized how vital it was to keep this data recovery a secret until the right moment. Otherwise, George would be sure to strike back again. Meanwhile, Rick was also moving closer to the truth. After his altercation with George, he was convinced his old friend was caught in a dangerous obsession. He decided to contact Andrea to offer his willingness to testify. He told her over the phone that for the past year, George had confessed vengeful thoughts, speaking of how he planned to humiliate Andrea so she would feel the same pain he'd experienced over her affair. "I'm not the kind of person who usually involves myself in other people's disputes," Rick warned. "But George has lost perspective. If you think my testimony could help in court, I'll give it." Andrea breathed a sigh of relief. She knew George valued Rick's opinion, given they'd been university friends and worked in areas linked to psychology. Perhaps his statement would confirm George's obsession with revenge. Laura quickly arranged a private meeting with Rick to document his statements, further bolstering Andrea's case. Even with these glimmers of hope, the situation at home remained dire. The distance between Lily and her mother was all too obvious. Andrea struggled to endure how her daughter avoided her gaze and chose to stay locked in her room. Each time Andrea approached with a plate of food or a kind word, Lily tensed as if expecting a rebuke at any second. The most devastating revelation came when, in a moment of confusion and distress, Lily sought out Andrea in the middle of the afternoon. The child was shaking, trying to get the words out, while Andrea held her breath, kneeling to her daughter's eye level so as not to intimidate her. "Mom," Lily started, her voice strangled. "Dad says that you don't love me, that you're only with me out of pity. He tells me you cheated on our family and didn't take care of me when I was little." Andrea's eyes filled with tears, hearing her daughter repeat George's lies with such fear and guilt. Unsure what to say, she wrapped her arms around Lily, feeling how the girl remained stiff at first, then broke down in a flood of sobs. "I'm sorry, Lily. I want you to know I love you more than anything in this world," Andrea whispered, holding back her own tears. "I want to explain everything truly, but right now I need you to be strong and trust me. Dad is wrong. No mistake I ever made can justify what he's telling you." Lily looked up, uncertain. For a second, it seemed the mother-daughter bond was resurfacing, but then Lily covered her face with her hands, inconsolable. It was enough, however, for Andrea to grasp the scope of the psychological harm George had inflicted. He hadn't just planted distrust of her mother, he'd poisoned the child's own memories, making her think her very existence was tied to betrayal. When Lily, overwhelmed, ran back to her room, Andrea remained standing in the hallway, hollow inside. There was no longer any doubt. This was not simply a grudge. George was willing to twist the past and drag his daughter into a pit of confusion and pain, all to satisfy his thirst for revenge. That very night, Andrea recounted to Laura, Mary, and Rick the scene she'd witnessed. They all agreed that the time for legal action was rapidly approaching. Thanks to Matteo, the digital evidence was now safe, and with Rick willing to testify, they were building a solid case against George. On top of that, Clara could provide a detailed report on Lily's emotional decline, underscoring the urgent need to protect the child. Andrea took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure before the imminent confrontation. She had spent weeks mentally preparing for this moment, yet her heart still pounded in her chest. She had been gathering the courage, collecting the evidence that George had tried so hard to destroy. Now she was determined to end the manipulation tormenting Lily. That afternoon, Laura the attorney arrived at the house on time, followed by Mary. They brought copies of all the recovered files, audio and video recordings, where George's voice was clearly heard, sowing distrust in the girl, manipulating her to hate her own mother. Holding those pieces of evidence, Andrea reminded herself she wasn't alone. She had the support of her sister, her lawyer, and, in a way, Rick's and Clara's testimonies. It wasn't just her suspicions anymore. They now had concrete proof that George, out of revenge for the infidelity, was willing to harm Lily in the process. When George appeared in the living room, he found Andrea and the two women waiting for him. He frowned upon seeing their resolute stares fixed on him. "What's going on here?" he asked, trying to sound self-assured. Andrea felt a tremor in her voice as she replied, but she managed to keep it firm. "We need to talk, and this time, I won't tolerate any more lies, George." Laura took out one of the devices, and after asking for silence, played a brief audio clip. George's voice telling Lily, "Your mother doesn't love you. She betrayed you and everyone else." His face twisted as he heard how clear it sounded, with no way to blame a recording defect or malicious editing. "What have you done?" he whispered, eyes flashing. "What was necessary?" Laura replied. "We've recovered the real files. We know you tampered with some of the recordings to accuse Andrea of mistreating Lily. Now we have the originals and an expert's testimony attesting to their authenticity." George tensed up, taking a step back. He tried to adopt an outraged expression, but the solid evidence left him disarmed. He looked at Andrea with barely contained resentment. "You dared spy on me. You twisted my words," he muttered, his voice shaking with fury. "No, they haven't been twisted." Andrea raised her voice, unwavering. "All the fabricated clips came from you, and you won't be able to use them against me anymore. We've got your recordings, the things you said to Lily, your threats. So, for our daughter's sake, I demand you leave the house. Otherwise, I'll file a formal complaint." George's gaze darkened. Mary stepped forward, standing beside her sister. Laura, maintaining a professional demeanor, pulled out some documents and prepared to read part of the lawsuit she'd drafted in case he refused. Confronted so directly, George lost control. "You took everything from me," he yelled, pointing at Andrea. "You cheated on me, you humiliated me, you made me look like a fool, and now you pretend you're the victim?" Andrea saw his anger boiling over, words spilling out without restraint. In that moment, he revealed what had thus far only been suspected. "So what if I manipulated Lily?" he erupted. "I just wanted you to feel the same pain you caused me. Lily was the only way I had left to get revenge." A chilling silence descended on the room. Andrea felt a shiver upon hearing his direct confession. Mary covered her mouth in horror. Laura stared at him in disbelief. But the most striking scene was that Lily, drawn by the shouting, had appeared at the top of the stairs. She had heard everything. With eyes wide, the girl suddenly understood that her father had used her in a twisted plan against her mother. "Dad," Lily murmured, stepping down 2 stairs. "You used me, just to get revenge." Those innocent words hung in the air like knives. George spun around, stunned, unable to respond. A flicker of guilt crossed his face, but it was too late. Lily ran toward the door, sobbing, fully realizing that her father had betrayed her trust, filling her mind with fear and lies just to hurt Andrea. With George's open confession, Andrea felt the last shred of compassion vanish. She looked at Laura and nodded. It was time to act. Within hours, formal legal proceedings began to charge George with manipulation and psychological abuse against Lily. The hearing took place a few days later in family court. Laura presented the recovered recordings in which George could be heard disparaging Andrea and pressuring Lily to mistrust her mother. Matteo, the IT specialist, testified under oath about how he had detected the tampering of the security files. Even Rick, George's friend and a psychologist, attended to describe the constant obsession and vengeful statements George had confided in him over the past months. Clara, Lily's music teacher, provided a moving account of the girl's emotional decline, her bouts of tears, and her unfounded rejection of her mother, until the manipulation was discovered. All of this painted a conclusive picture for the judge. Out of revenge, George had jeopardized his daughter's mental stability, making her believe her mother hated her. Lily was also interviewed by forensic psychologists in a protected setting. Having realized the truth, The child described, sadly, how her father would come at night to show her that Andrea didn't love her. Hearing these accounts, the judge immediately ordered protective measures for Lily and restricted George's visitation until further notice. In a provisional ruling, the court granted Andrea primary custody, pending evaluation of any additional risk to the child. Sitting in the defendant's seat, George's face showed rage and humiliation. His claim that it was all a misunderstanding carried no weight against the evidence and testimonies. He realized he had lost the battle, and with it, his control over Lily. Not even his repeated mention of Andrea's infidelity, used yet again to discredit her, convinced the judge. The systematic manipulation of a minor was undeniable. That same week, while the court order was put into effect, Mary took Andrea and Lily in at her home. Still shaken by her father's revelations, Lily took days to open up and speak clearly. Andrea devoted every free moment to comforting her, hugging her, and reassuring her of her unconditional love. With great patience, Lily began drawing closer to her mother again, although the pain of what she'd experienced lingered. Through calm conversations and simple games, they started rebuilding the trust George had tried to destroy. The subplot involving Clara and Rick also found a natural resolution. Clara, relieved, continued supporting Lily at school, offering extracurricular music sessions so she could channel her emotions. Rick, for his part, formally confirmed George's obsessive behavior to the authorities, playing a key role in demonstrating that this was no temporary conflict, but a deep-seated problem that had endangered the child's well-being. Laura, satisfied with the provisional verdict, cautioned Andrea that a longer process might begin if George appealed, but her position was solid. The evidence, the testimonies, and George's spontaneous confession had exposed him. In any case, they had everything necessary to defend Lily's custody. With that, the conflict that threatened to destroy the mother-daughter bond found both a legal and moral outlet. George, forced to leave the house, lost the control he had so fervently wielded. Lily, now protected, began the journey to heal from the wounds inflicted by her own father. Andrea, though knowing full well that it would take time for the scars to fade, finally felt her burden of guilt lighten. Her past mistake did not justify the harm George had caused, and now she had the chance to rebuild her life with her daughter without the destructive shadow of vengeance hanging over them. Ultimately, the family that had once seemed close was indeed left fractured, but with a clear promise of renewal for Andrea and Lily. George's mask had fallen for all to see, and with Clara, Rick, Laura, and Mary's support, mother and daughter embarked on a new beginning, convinced that, together, they could leave behind the nocturnal nightmare that had tormented them for so long. A difficult process lay ahead, but at least the truth had come to light, and George's manipulation would no longer have a place in their lives. Now, Andrea walked down the hallway of the family therapy center with her heart in her throat, yet clinging to her determination to heal. She held Lily's hand, and while the girl's eyes still betrayed a hint of fear, they also showed more serenity than in recent weeks. After all that had shaken their home, mother and daughter were now attending joint sessions with a children's psychologist. The goal was clear: to rebuild their relationship, and above all, help Lily overcome the emotional scars her father's manipulation had left behind. In the waiting room, the atmosphere was surprisingly warm. There were plush chairs, paintings of tranquil landscapes, and a small table covered with children's books. Lily sat down timidly, leafing through one of the books without much focus. Andrea, beside her, tried to reassure her by gently rubbing her shoulder. After a few minutes, the door opened, and Dr. Elena Peralta, the family therapist, invited them in. The office was spacious and bright, with a corner filled with toys and art supplies. Lily glanced around, not yet daring to approach the play materials. She merely sat down next to Andrea, on a couple of cushions on the floor, following Dr. Peralta's usual practice of creating a more relaxed environment than a formal consultation. "Welcome," said the therapist, smiling warmly. "How have you both been feeling this week?" Andrea hesitated between recounting the details of the legal tension and the potential progress of the case against George. But since the very first session, the doctor had insisted on focusing on Lily's emotions and the mother-daughter reunion. So Andrea took a deep breath and spoke honestly. "It's been hard, but I think we're making progress. Lily is sleeping a bit better, and though she's still nervous, I can see she's more willing to talk about her feelings." Lily lowered her gaze, shifting slightly on the cushion. In a gentle voice, the doctor addressed her. "What about you, Lily? How do you feel at home?" The girl looked up and shrugged. After a few moments, she finally answered, I don't wake up so many times at night anymore, and Mum's been telling me bedtime stories." Andrea looked at her daughter tenderly and managed a grateful smile for that simple step toward rebuilding trust. During the session, Dr. Peralta guided them through communication exercises. She encouraged Lily to draw how she used to feel back when she'd wake up at night, frightened, and how she feels now that she's realized her mother wasn't the villain her father had portrayed. Even so, the process wouldn't be instant. The after effects of such manipulation might take months or even years to fully heal. Meanwhile, at school, Clara had once again welcomed Lily into her music and choir classes. After the avalanche of conflicts, the girl had been absent for a while, first because of stress, and then because of legal errands Andrea had to handle. When Clara saw her return to the classroom, she noticed something different. Although Lily was still quieter and more withdrawn than before this whole nightmare began, there was a glimmer of light in her eyes when she sat at the piano or listened to a gentle melody. During the first choir rehearsal after her return, Lily tried her best to sing the notes, though her voice occasionally broke with emotion. Clara rested a hand on her shoulder, assuring her how happy she was to have her back. Gradually, music became a refuge again, a space where Lily could express herself without fear of judgment or manipulation. From the classroom door, Andrea silently thanked the teacher for her unconditional support. Away from school, on the legal front, George faced an uncertain future. The family court judge had ruled that before any contact with Lily, he had to undergo a thorough psychological evaluation. Moreover, any visits he might eventually be allowed would have to be supervised by specialized staff to ensure the child's emotional safety. Andrea didn't want to deprive Lily of a relationship with her father forever, but she also wouldn't risk her daughter's stability. It all depended on whether George showed genuine change and proved he could put Lily's well-being ahead of his own resentments. Following Rick's recommendation, the psychologist who had testified against him, George enrolled in an anger management and therapy program. He hadn't done it voluntarily, but rather under pressure from the possibility of losing his right to see Lily. It was still too soon to tell if that therapy would have any real effect. No one could be certain, but for the time being, the court had imposed strict boundaries. Laura, Andrea's lawyer, confirmed that it was in the child's best interest. Only if the psychological reports demonstrated significant progress would George be able to request less restrictive visitation rights. The most notable change could be felt in the new family dynamic Andrea and Lily were forging. Little by little, the girl began to reconstruct her memories without the distortions her father had planted. Andrea, in turn, worked through her own guilt and her need to forgive herself for the infidelity that had fueled George's rage. Both attended regular sessions with Dr. Peralta, where they practiced communication techniques and therapeutic games to strengthen their bond. During one of those afternoons, after finishing a session, something happened that Andrea would never forget. On their way home, Lily took her mother's hand and looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "Mom, I want you to know I love you a lot, and that I know you've tried really hard to protect me." Andrea felt a lump in her throat. She knelt so she was eye level with her daughter and answered softly, "I love you too, Lily. Nothing and no one can change that." They embraced with deep tenderness, no further words needed. It was the first time since the truth had come out that Lily had approached Andrea spontaneously. In that simple gesture, Andrea sensed the promise of a brighter future for them both. As the days passed, the small apartment where Mary was hosting them gradually filled with soft laughter and laid-back conversations. Mary welcomed them joyfully, glad to see how Lily was returning to her habit of sharing little school anecdotes or stories about her music rehearsals, and although the girl still got nervous when her father's name came up, she felt safe in that environment. One Sunday afternoon, they were all sitting around the table, having made a cake to celebrate Lily's return to choir practice. After cutting a slice each, the girl took out her sheet music and worked up the courage to sing a short piece. Her voice was still a bit shaky, but filled with emotion. Her singing echoed through the living room, and Andrea fought back tears. It was the first time in a long while she'd heard her daughter sing without the shadow of fear hovering over every note. In that moment, Andrea realized that while they still had a long road ahead to heal those wounds, the worst of it was behind them. The specter of George's resentment no longer controlled their every move. There would be more hearings, and they'd have to wait to see the outcome of George's mandatory therapy and deal with possible setbacks. Even so, they had something they'd lost before: hope. The epilogue of that dark tale was not about a perfect family regaining its unity. Rather, it marked the beginning of a different life, one in which Andrea and Lily, from a place of honesty and understanding, gave themselves the chance to rebuild their trust and love. They no longer lived under the nightly terror of hearing murmurs in the girl's bedroom or the threat of doctored recordings. Now, day after day, the sun shone through the windows with a clarity that encouraged them to keep moving forward, free from the weight that once shrouded their lives. And so, with Lily's music as the soundtrack and the certainty that truth had prevailed, mother and daughter held on tight to one another. Sharing one last knowing glance, they sealed their pledge to continue this healing process together, without the fear of anyone coming between them again. As evening fell, Andrea and Lily smiled quietly, feeling that, for the first time in a long while, the future held a glimmer of genuine peace. And that's where our story ends. Thank you for joining us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and share for more stories like this. Remember, every story teaches us something, and the next one could be yours. See you in the next video.